The Boston County Courthouse gleamed like it always did on verdict days, only this time, I was the one on trial. I'd walked through those same glass doors hundreds of times before, usually wearing confidence like armor, my case files tucked under one arm, my chin raised, ready to prosecute the guilty. But that morning, my steps felt heavier. Every echo off the marble floor reminded me that today, I was the accused. The cameras flashed before I could even reach the security gate. Reporters swarmed, microphones stabbing the air with questions I refused to answer. Ms. Carter, how does it feel to be sued by your own parents? Is it true your grandfather left you everything? I kept walking. My silence became their headline. Inside, the courtroom looked colder than I remembered. Rows of wooden benches, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, the smell of old paper and polished wood. But what froze me in place wasn't the room, it was them. Linda and Mark Carter. My parents. They sat at the plaintiff's table, dressed as though grief itself had become a costume. My mother's black suit sharp enough to cut glass, my father's expression rehearsed to look wounded. They didn't even flinch when our eyes met. Instead, my mother smirked, that same cruel little twist of her lips she used to give waiters when she wanted to feel important. Her lawyer, Archer Blake, whispered something that made her chuckle under her breath. Maybe it was about how poetic it was that the daughter they'd abandoned would now stand across from them, in court. The irony was sharp enough to taste. When Judge Rivers entered, the room fell into order. I stood as protocol demanded, keeping my breathing steady. But when his eyes met mine, I saw the flicker of recognition. Ms. Carter, he said, his tone caught between surprise and disbelief. As in, Prosecutor Carter. I gave a small nod. The corners of his mouth tightened. Everyone in Boston's legal circle knew me as the young woman who'd once handled domestic abuse cases with precision and compassion. But no one expected to see me here, defending myself against the people who were supposed to protect me. Archer began the opening statement, spinning his story like silk. How tragic, he said, that after the passing of Charles Carter, his granddaughter manipulated his frail state of mind to secure his estate for herself. My hands curled into fists beneath the table. Manipulated? My grandfather was the only person who ever saw me. The only one who believed in me when they walked away. Their words buzzed like hornets in my ears, each one stinging deeper. Betrayal has a sound. It's the echo of your mother's voice accusing you of greed for loving the man who raised you. I forced myself to stay silent. Because this wasn't the place to cry, this was the place to win. And as I sat there, watching them perform their pity for the crowd, I made myself a quiet promise. They had no idea their abandoned daughter had become a prosecutor, and their worst nightmare. I wasn't born into abandonment, I was left there. The story my parents used to tell was that they were too young to raise a child, that they needed a few months to get settled. But the truth was simpler. They just didn't want to be parents. I was 6 months old the morning they left me on my grandparents' porch. My grandfather, Charles, told me later that the knock came just after sunrise. When he opened the door, he found a small suitcase, a folded blanket, and me. My mother's perfume still lingered in the air, like guilt trying to disguise itself as love. There was a note tucked under the handle of the baby carrier. We'll be back when things are stable. They never said whose stability they were waiting for. Charles and Margaret Carter weren't rich, not then. They were teachers, kind and humble, with more love than money. But from that moment, they became my entire world. My earliest memories aren't of toys or lullabies, they're of my grandmother's hands, always warm, always smelling faintly of soap and flour. She'd hum old songs from her childhood while feeding me mashed bananas, smiling even when she was tired. And my grandfather, he'd lift me high onto his shoulders, letting me touch the low-hanging apple blossoms in our backyard. They never spoke poorly of Linda and Mark, never filled my head with bitterness. Instead, they gave me a childhood built on gentleness, the kind that makes you think the world is kind, too. But the truth has a way of sneaking into quiet rooms. Every birthday, I'd wait by the phone. Every Christmas, I'd stare at the driveway, hoping a car would pull in. I used to imagine what they looked like. My mother's laugh, my father's voice, as if I could invent them into existence. But they never came. Years passed, and the little girl who waited by the window learned to stop asking. Margaret's health began to fade when I was 12. She'd hide the pain behind smiles, insisting it was just a cold. But one night, as thunder rolled across the sky, I heard my grandfather crying in the kitchen, a sound that shattered something inside me. When she passed, the world went quiet. Even the house felt emptier, like it was holding its breath. I remember standing beside her grave, clutching the daisy she loved most, whispering, "Don't worry, Grandma. I'll take care of him." From that day on, I became Charles's little shadow. We shared morning tea, repaired fences, and read in silence by the fire. I grew up in the warmth of a man who believed love didn't have to be spoken, it could be shown over and over, until it became a promise. But deep down, I still wondered why my parents never looked back. Maybe I thought they'd show up when I graduated, or when I got my first job. But they didn't. Not even when Charles retired. Even then, I didn't know they'd only return when money entered the picture. It started with a storm, and a locked wooden box my grandfather never mentioned. The rain that night came down like grief itself, steady, cold, relentless. It was the kind of night that made silence feel louder. The day before, I had buried Charles Carter, the only parent I had ever truly known. The house felt haunted without him. His slippers were still by the door. His cup, half polished on the counter. I wandered into his study because it still smelled like him, cedarwood, ink, and old books. The desk lamp cast a soft glow over stacks of letters, neatly arranged like he'd meant to finish sorting them. And then, tucked beneath an old ledger of property taxes, I saw it, a small wooden box with a brass lock. For some reason, my heartbeat quickened. Charles was a man of transparency. He never kept secrets, or so I thought. I tried the drawers for a key. Nothing. Then I remembered his walking stick. He'd once shown me how he'd hidden spare keys inside its handle. When the small silver key clicked into the lock, it felt like opening the past. Inside were 3 ledgers, each bound in dark leather. Dates stretched back over 20 years. At first, I thought they were donation records. He often gave quietly to charity. But when I turned the first page, my stomach sank. Each entry was labeled, "Transfer to L. Carter, medical support." Then another, "Loan to M. Carter, investment capital." Another, "Emergency expense, repayment promised by next quarter." Page after page, year after year, the sums grew bigger. 30,000, 60, 80. Some marked final, others marked gift. By the time I reached the end, the total exceeded $600,000. My breath caught. He'd given them money. Again and again. Even after they'd left me. Even after decades of silence. In the second ledger, I found photocopies of checks, all signed by him. But stapled behind them were something worse. Printed emails. From Linda. Cold. Manipulative. "Dad, I know you don't want to disappoint Josephine, but if you don't send this, we'll lose everything. She doesn't need to know. You owe us this, after what you did." Each line felt like a blade. They hadn't just taken advantage of him, they'd guilt-tripped him into submission. They'd stolen from a kind man who couldn't say no to his own blood. Tears blurred the ink as I closed the book. That's when I saw an envelope at the bottom of the box. My name, written in his careful handwriting. My dearest Joe, it began. If you are reading this, it means I'm gone. I know what your parents have done. I forgave them in my heart, but forgiveness doesn't mean blindness. The truth must be protected. You are that truth. You are my legacy. Don't let shame or anger guide you. Let justice do it. By the time I finished reading, I was shaking, not with sadness, but purpose. He hadn't left me a secret. He'd left me a mission. They thought they'd stolen from an old man, but they were about to face his heir. They didn't even wait for the funeral flowers to wilt before coming for his money. It had only been 9 days since we laid Charles Carter to rest. The scent of lilies still lingered in the hallway, their petals browning at the edges. I was still sorting through condolence cards when the first newspaper headline hit. Boston heiress under fire. Parents claim manipulation in grandfather's will. My hands went cold as I read the article. There it was, my name, printed beneath my mother's trembling face in a photo she must have posed for. Her words dripped with false sorrow. We only want what's fair. Josephine convinced my father to rewrite everything while he was ill. We just want justice. Justice. That word had never sounded so dirty. Within hours, the story spread. Old friends stopped calling. Strangers filled comment sections with judgment. Greedy. Ungrateful. Gold digger. It didn't matter that not one of them knew the truth. My mother's lies had already done their damage. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery, not because I wanted peace, but because I needed strength. The wind was sharp that day, tugging at my coat as if trying to pull me away. I knelt by Charles's grave, brushing away the leaves that had gathered over his name. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," I whispered. "You told me to be ready, but I didn't think they'd do this. Not like this." For a long time, I just sat there, listening to the trees. And then I heard a voice behind me, soft, gravelly. "You don't owe them your peace, Joe." It was Thomas Wilson, my grandfather's oldest friend and the family's former attorney. He looked older than I remembered, his face marked by both age and loyalty. "Your grandfather warned me this might happen," he said, handing me a folder. He updated his will legally and mentally sound. I kept every record, every signature, every witness. "You're covered." My throat tightened. "Then why does it still hurt this much?" "Because betrayal isn't about money," he replied. "It's about realizing blood can lie." Those words stayed with me. Over the next few days, help began to appear in unexpected places. Judge Rivers, a man I'd once worked alongside, reached out privately. "If you need a character witness," he said, "I'll be there." Even Maria, our old housekeeper, came by with tears in her eyes and a stack of letters Charles had asked her to keep safe. Each one was another thread of truth, proof of his sound mind and his trust in me. The community that had once gossiped now began to remember who I really was, the woman who'd helped their daughters in domestic court, who volunteered at youth shelters, who fought for fairness long before this. Piece by piece, I rebuilt my footing. My grief turned into focus, my fear into fire. So when the official court notice arrived, Carter versus Carter, I didn't crumble. By the time they filed the lawsuit, I'd already begun building my defense, one truth at a time. If they wanted war, they picked the wrong prosecutor. Grief is heavy, but strategy is sharp. And when you've spent years studying deceit in the courtroom, you start recognizing it in people, too, especially when those people share your last name. The morning after the lawsuit notice arrived, I laid everything out on the dining table. The ledgers, the letters, the emails. My grandfather's handwriting stared back at me like a quiet promise. Don't let them rewrite our story. I wasn't going to. The first step was proving Charles Carter had been fully competent when he signed his will. My parents' claim was that old age and confusion made him susceptible to manipulation. It was a clever lie, emotional, dramatic, believable, to anyone who hadn't known him. So I called everyone who had. His doctor, Dr. Feldman, remembered Charles as sharp, articulate, and stubborn. The banker described him as meticulous with numbers. Even Maria, our housekeeper, testified how he still balanced his own accounts every Friday night, double-checking receipts with his reading glasses perched low on his nose. Every statement built a wall around the truth, one they couldn't climb. But my favorite witness was the one they never expected, the notary. He'd recorded Charles's signature just 6 months before his death. He cracked a joke about outliving us all, the man laughed on record. Didn't seem confused to me. When I submitted the compilation of statements, my mother's attorney, Archer Blake, rolled his eyes across the table. Classic overkill, he muttered. I smiled. Classic preparation. A week later, the court dismissed their first motion, the one claiming mental incompetence. Judge Rivers's ruling was clear. The evidence provided by Ms. Carter demonstrates her grandfather's full mental clarity and intent. The plaintiff's claim lacks merit. It was only a small win, but it felt monumental. Because for the first time, I wasn't just defending myself, I was reclaiming him. I walked out of the courthouse that day with my head high. The cold Boston air hit my face like a challenge, but I didn't flinch. That night, as I sat at my desk surrounded by old photographs and paperwork, I realized something. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about legacy. Charles had built his life on honesty, on hard work, on the belief that integrity mattered more than inheritance. And my parents, they'd spent decades trying to take shortcuts, trying to cheat their way into comfort. Their greed wasn't just stealing from me. It was spitting on everything he stood for. I wasn't just fighting for his estate anymore. I was fighting for his name. As the rain began again outside, I opened his last letter once more, tracing the words that had started it all. Let justice, not anger, guide you. I smiled faintly, whispering, Don't worry, Grandpa. I'm ready now. Tomorrow, I wouldn't just defend myself. I'd expose 22 years of deceit. The courtroom smelled of coffee, perfume, and fear, mostly theirs. Boston County Courthouse had seen its share of scandals, but today, it felt like every whisper was about us. The daughter versus her parents. The prosecutor turned defendant. The family feud no one could look away from. I walked in wearing the same charcoal gray suit I'd worn in my very first trial as a prosecutor, back when I still believed justice was simple. It wasn't, but I'd learned how to make it visible. Linda and Mark sat at the plaintiff's table, side by side. Their matching navy outfits almost looked rehearsed, as if they were trying to play the role of the grieving parents seeking fairness. Their lawyer, Archer Blake, kept his smug smile as he whispered last-minute coaching into their ears. Judge Rivers entered, and the murmur fell silent. All rise. The trial had begun. Blake started strong, or at least he tried to. He painted me as a manipulative granddaughter who had isolated an aging man and seized his estate through emotional control. Each word was heavy with practiced pity. And when he gestured toward me, calling me an expert at persuasion, trained by the system, the gallery gasped, as if my career itself was proof of guilt. But I didn't flinch. I just waited. When it was my turn, I rose, calm and deliberate, and placed a single folder on the evidence table. Inside were bank transfers totaling $660,000, all sent from Charles Carter's accounts to Linda and Mark over the course of 22 years. Every payment marked as loan assistance, car repairs, or temporary support. None of it repaid. I watched their faces drain of color. "Your Honor," I said, voice steady, "this wasn't a neglected father. It was a man systematically drained by the very people now calling themselves victims." Gasps. Pens stopped moving. Even the reporters froze. Then I called my first witness, Mr. Jensen, a lawyer who'd handled several inheritance disputes for Linda in the past. He testified that she'd borrowed from multiple relatives, and each time promised repayment that never came. Then came Mrs. Green, my grandfather's former accountant. She confirmed the payments and described how Charles once said, "If I stop helping them, they'll turn against me. But I can't let that happen while I'm alive." The room grew colder. By midday, their carefully painted image had started to crack. During recess, I caught sight of a journalist typing furiously on her phone. The headline appeared hours later online, "Parents suing daughter for inheritance, but who's the real victim?" The tide was shifting. Slowly, but unmistakably. When court adjourned for the day, my parents didn't look at me. They just gathered their papers and walked out, stiff, silent, wounded pride wrapped in designer coats. As I packed up my own files, Judge Rivers paused before leaving the bench. "You handled yourself well today, Ms. Carter," he said softly. "It's not easy facing blood with evidence." I nodded, barely managing a smile. Outside, the cold November air bit against my skin, but I felt nothing. Round one was mine. But deep down, I knew they weren't done lying. Not yet. When manipulation stops working, people like Linda start to beg. It was late. Too late for visitors. The courthouse lights had dimmed, and even the janitors were packing up. I was sorting through my files when the security guard poked his head in. "Ms. Carter, there's someone here to see you." I didn't have to ask who. Linda walked in wrapped in a beige coat, her face painted in the same soft sadness she used to wear at funerals, a mask that looked almost believable if you didn't know what hid beneath it. "Josephine," she said quietly, voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed. "You look tired. You're working yourself to death." I didn't answer. I just closed my folder and waited. She sighed, the kind of long, tragic sigh designed to melt walls. "I never wanted it to come to this," she continued. "The lawyers, the court, the ugliness. We're family, sweetheart. We can fix this." Family. The word landed like a stone in my chest. I hadn't heard her call me sweetheart since I was 10. She sat down across from me, clutching her purse. "Your father's not doing well. All this stress, it's killing him. And you've always been so stubborn, just like your grandfather." Then came the envelope. Thick, white, the kind that smelled like perfume and trouble. "This is a settlement," she said softly. "We'll drop the case. You just sign over half the inheritance. No one needs to know the details. You keep your dignity, we keep peace." I stared at the envelope. Half the inheritance. After everything. She smiled weakly, tears glistening like diamonds. "I'm still your mother, Joe. I made mistakes, I know that. But can't we start over? You've punished us enough." And for one fragile moment, I almost believed her. Because underneath the cold anger, there was still that little girl who used to wait by the window, hoping to see headlights in the driveway. Hoping they'd come back for her. Hoping for love that never arrived. The ache of that child flickered inside me, reaching toward the sound of a mother's voice that no longer existed. But then, I saw it. The tiny smirk she tried to hide when she thought I might say yes. The same smirk she wore when she lied to Charles. When she lied to me. I leaned back, steadying my breath. You don't want peace, Linda. You want silence. And I'm done giving it to you. Her tears vanished like morning fog. You'll regret this, she hissed, standing so fast her chair scraped the floor. You always were ungrateful. I rose too, calm, cold, unshaken. And you always were predictable. For a long second, we just stood there. Mother and daughter. Two strangers connected only by blood and unfinished war. Then she turned, storming out of the room, her perfume lingering like poison in the air. I stared at the empty doorway, my pulse steady again. The little girl inside me finally went quiet. Not hurt, not scared, just done. Tomorrow, she'd finally see who I'd become, her reckoning. For the first time in my life, my mother had to listen to me, under oath. The courtroom was packed. Cameras flashed outside the doors, journalists filled the gallery, and even the judge's gavel couldn't silence the buzz of curiosity. After weeks of evidence, testimony, and buried secrets, it had all come down to this. Archer Blake, my parents' lawyer, rose first. His voice was smooth, dripping with fake empathy. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, pacing slowly, this isn't about greed. It's about love, the love of parents who were deceived by their daughter. A daughter who used her legal knowledge to twist an elderly man's affection into control. My clients only seek fairness. He looked toward me, pausing for dramatic effect. She took advantage of family. She betrayed blood. I didn't flinch. I'd heard lies from better men. When it was my turn, I walked to the stand slowly, not as a prosecutor, not as a defendant, but as a granddaughter. Your Honor, I began. For years, I prosecuted people who betrayed the ones who trusted them. I never thought one day I'd be facing my own family across the aisle. I took a breath and laid out the truth. The forged documents, the missing funds, the 22 years of payments my grandfather made to keep peace that never existed. Then I turned to the projector screen. This, I said softly, is Charles Carter's final message, recorded 3 months before his passing. The courtroom fell into silence as the video flickered to life. My grandfather's face appeared, older, tired, but smiling. If you're watching this, he said, I suppose the fighting has begun. To my daughter and son-in-law, I forgive you, but forgiveness doesn't erase truth. You took what you wanted while I was alive. Let my granddaughter keep what I chose to give her after I'm gone. She's earned it, not through blood, but through loyalty. Linda's hand shot to her mouth. Mark stared at the screen, pale and motionless. When the video ended, I unfolded a single piece of paper, Charles's final handwritten letter to the court. This will is not about money. It's about principle. Let honesty be rewarded, and deceit be seen for what it is. Judge Rivers read the letter twice, quietly. Then he removed his glasses and looked at my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, he said firmly, this court finds no evidence of coercion or incompetence. Instead, what we see is a pattern of manipulation and financial exploitation on your part. The will stands. The estate belongs solely to Ms. Josephine Carter. Gasps rippled through the room. Linda's lips trembled, but no words came out. Archer Blake's polished confidence shattered as he fumbled his papers. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I just closed my eyes and breathed, for the first time in years, without guilt or fear. Outside, reporters shouted questions, but their voices blurred into wind. I looked up at the courthouse steps, sunlight spilling across the marble, and thought of Charles. They wanted an inheritance, I whispered. What they got was justice. I reached into my pocket and touched the folded letter one last time. His words still echoed in my mind, steady and warm. Let justice, not anger, guide you. And for once I knew I had. Because blood may define where you come from, but loyalty defines who you become. Like if you believe family is earned, not inherited. Some victories don't come with trophies, they come with peace. They took everything from her, except her truth. And that's what saved her. Because family isn't blood, it's loyalty. If you've ever fought alone and won, hit like. Subscribe for more real courtroom stories that hit the heart.